First of all, I would love to thank our presenters, Mr. Abdul Nasser Al-Muadia, Mrs. Céline Jerizi, and Mr. François Borga for the fruitful insight that they have given us about the reasons of the conflict, whether they were regional or international. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Ibrahim Khattabi for hosting the first session. Another point, I really apologize to have announced that we have limited the questions to 4 questions per session because we have a very limited time. And because we have exceeded the time limit so much, we have to skip the second coffee break and welcome our moderator of the second session, which is under the title, The War in Yemen and its Repercussions, Mrs. Laura Gavrieux. And please welcome her on stage.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would just like to make a little precision. I am introduced in the program as an activist and a researcher. It's not exactly true. I am a war reporter. I mainly cover war zones in Middle East, and I used to be a philosophy researcher. I used to work on post-conflict situations. So that's just about my official status. Please welcome our speakers for the second session. Patricia Lydell, who's a former journalist. She's Canadian. She used to work and live in Yemen, and now she's an international senior advisor. So she will talk to us about, I guess, the duty to protect in Yemen and how it felt, obviously. Other speaker is Mr. Nabil Al-Baidani. Mr. Al-Baidani is the former executive director of the NGO SAM, Organization for Rights and Liberties, which is based in Geneva. And he's going to talk to us about human rights in Yemen and the war, and I guess that his experience as a former executive director of this NGO will allow him to speak about crime, criminals, and maybe the prosecutions that we can hope in the future. So our main acts during this panel, and I would like us to hold the program as we are so late. We will talk about the destructions, of course, at all levels of Yemen after all those years of wars. We will talk about human rights violations, and of course, last but not least, we will talk about impact on the society, on civil peace, but also on the ties between people, because we know that a war doesn't only destroy infrastructures, it also destroys the civil contract and human connections between people in a society. So that's a program for this panel, and I will introduce first Mr. Al-Baidani for the first paper. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Faculty, I don't know how long I have.
Well, I will ask you not to exceed 15 minutes, please.
Wow.
It's 20 minutes maximum.
Okay. سأتحدث بالعربية. أولاً أشكر إدارة منظمة توكل كرمان على استضافتي.
I will speak in Arabic. First, I would like to thank the administration of Tawakkol Karman Foundation for this invitation. And I want the paper to be different, but it will be a heavy presentation to some extent because it will narrate a lot of facts. And of course, talking about the human rights violations is not something light to talk about. This paper seeks to talk about the reality of human rights violations in Yemen and the relation of these violations with the relation in the community before and now, and the context, the community, the social context, and I will give a preview of human rights before the war and after this war. This study is just a personal insight, and it's not a strong scientific research. It's only observation, my own observations for realities and facts. I will narrate or make reference to the news reports and the resources that I made in the collecting the information. I'm not going to go very far in history, but I will speak about a very specific point that a lot of Yemenis don't misinterpret or underestimate. There is this discrimination and lack of and inequality in Yemen at general. We don't have that study that specified that in reality, but in line with the autocratic regime and the lack of the state, the bad habits and the traditions made as social context that facilitate the human rights. The community was categorized on discriminatory basis. We can't talk about the human rights violations without talking about the structure of the Yemeni community. This structure is one of the factors that facilitated the human rights. I will try to be as brief as possible. It's not as far as racism, but in general, there is a social context that imposes this discrimination or inequality. Looking back in history, we see that the discrimination started in the age of Imam Yahya Hamid al-Din, when there was a religious theological system that controls and manipulates and controls all the power in one family, leaving behind ignorant and backwards community that lacks human rights. Things wasn't very different in the era of Ali Abdullah Saleh. It was a very bad autocratic regime, and the human rights violations became a daily practice that are widely accepted. There is a hidden structure for the community. Sometimes we cannot understand it or imagine it. The first categorization of this structure, there are several factors for the inequality and discrimination in Yemen. The first, then the lineage, race, and the family. Until now, we ask, where are you from? Where did you come from? And questions like that. Whereas, in general, advanced communities don't think a lot about these issues. But for Yemenis, for us, this was important. So, lineage, family, and origin is a kind of discrimination in the community. A lot of people received advantages without being competent for these positions, and that facilitated for them to be wealthy and to have, through the social status they have because they belong to a certain tribe or a certain family. Then the handicraft and professions comes second. For us as Yemenis, it is very important for us to talk about the profession of others. So the community practice harsh discrimination against the professions and industries and handicrafts, which makes a lot of Yemeni young people abandon handicrafts because of this discrimination, like hairdressing, working as a butcher, selling meats, farming, sewing, and a lot of other functions or professions, as well as things that has to do with the creativity, like playing music, singing, dancing, acting. These are always looked down at in the Yemeni community. The third factor, the factor of the military rank and the position, government position. So if when anybody gets a position, whether military or in political sphere, gives them immunities. So some officials practice violations, whether financial corruption or any other violations, without paying heed to the community. Fourth, belonging to a region, a geographical region. One of the most important discrimination factors is the region where people come from, because both regimes, Hamid al-Din family and the theological system, and the chaotic regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh, made Sana'a more influential over other regions, because where there is the control of money, and the families, the main families, and the power come from that area. So people who come from the hill control the positions in power, and the further you go to the margins, the less people that go to that have positions, and the more people angry against the government, and by nature against the state. Number 5, or the 5th factor, is the gender, and here the perception of weakness is linked to women. So people perceive women that she is unable to be independent and to rely on herself without masculine supervision and control. The bad traditions and habits and the religious verdicts strengthened these practices, which made women and children the weakest link in the community. Number 6, which is the most important one for me, we can say the skin color is one of the hidden and unspoken of aspects of discrimination, because in the community people pay a lot of attention on the origin and the lineage, and people of darker skin are always dealt with or faced with a lot of discrimination and racism sometimes. With all of these factors that I mentioned, we can build networks and groups and even a pyramid or a hierarchy of the Yemeni community. As I said, these are only observations. It needs further scientific study for them. And on the top of this hierarchy, we have the network of the military leaderships and government positions. The commanders of security apparatuses and the military are at the top of this hierarchy. Then comes the tribal leaders and the most important or most prominent families. They comes next. Number 3, religious and religious leaders and their families and jurists. They come third on this hierarchy. The 4th level is the partisan and the political leadership network in Yemen. Until now, we are speaking about very old leaders, political leaders. Some of them are over 80 years of old, that are talking about the politics of Yemen, whereas we don't see any new leadership or young people that come on the scene. These 4 first categories are the real leadership of the country. Nobody else joined or participated in that. Even if we want to find or overcome that, we can't find anybody. Then comes businessmen and the professionals in media and academics. This is another one. Then those who work in handicrafts, they are another category. Then people who work in arts, like actors, singers, dancers, they are looked down at, and the lowest level is the women and the children. Then people of darker skin, then the marginalized people or the servants. This community that is built in such a way, we find that a lot of people who try to merge or to influence the political process, they can't do that. You will be surprised that most of the violations that are perpetrated in this country starts from after the fourth level on the people of a profession, women, children, people of dark skin and marginalized people. Whereas the rest of the people or the categories, they are protected from these issues. Even in the darkest times of the conflict in Yemen, they were protected from these violations in the Yemeni community. I don't want here to get about the violations and count them, because you can find them on readily available on the internet, but I want to talk about the reasons of these violations for the Yemenis to understand them and for the interested foreigners. The phenomenon of stigma and shame. We are a community of shame and stigma, and traditions affect the violations of human rights. Half of the population can be categorized that they are dominant, or they use the slogan of honor and all the connotation or all things that are linked to that for protecting the honor of the tribe or the family. Then we have poverty. We are ashamed to speak about poverty. In the world, nobody feels ashamed to say that he is poor, but in Yemen, it is one of the shameful things to talk about the economic condition or to show how poor they are, because they don't want to be looked down at the community. In media, we can see a lot of stories of of women who died in their houses because they didn't want to go out of their homes to ask for assistance or for relief. We have the victims of sexual violence. Victims of sexual violence are excluded, and sometimes they are abandoned by even their families. Then we have shame from the work of women. This is true. Although women have full political rights, but women still suffer from the perception of the community for her if she is working. So we only partly managed to get out of the stigma of the working women, maybe only in education and medical fields, but they are still a stigma that women suffer from in other fields. Talking about now the practices or the violations of human rights in Yemen, I will categorize them into two categories. One that are ongoing violations that were there before the war, and the second category is the violations that rose during the war or increased after the war. The ongoing violations are the violations against children, abuse, physical harm. The first abuse against the children starts with the birth of the child, because there is no unified registry for the children. So you can't really know the birth date of the child unless one of the parents registered them. So they only after a few years they are registered. There is no law that prevents the hurt or the harm of the children or prevent them or register that. But sometimes in media we see some stories of abuses for children. There is an international study that was issued in 2010 under the title of abusing children in 28 countries, and the study found that the highest level of psychological harm was in Yemen, and with a very high percentage of the sample. WHO shows that international studies showed that 1/4 of the adults in Yemen report being harmed. So 1/4 of those who were harmed talk about sexual harassment in childhood, and one of them is women, and one of each 5 of those people are women, and one of each 13 person reports being sexually harassed. These are horrifying numbers we must take into consideration. Child labor, there is a joint report by a governmental, the census department with the international agencies say that the number of children working in Yemen is estimated to be 1.6 million children in Yemen. Can you imagine that 1.6 million children are working now in Yemen? Recruitment, with the lack of education and ignorance, of course, recruitment becomes increased. In a field report in 2010 made by SIAJ in collaboration with UNICEF, reported that about 50% of fighters in the north are children. Can you imagine that? Human Rights Watch reported that the Houthi government and loyalist parties and other militias or other fighting groups used children as fighters, and their number amounts to the 1/3 of all the fighters in Yemen. That was in 2015 maybe. And the United Nations reported on recruiting children. In 2014, Yemen signed a working plan for putting an end to the recruitment of children, but because of the conflict and the lack of an efficient government, it wasn't enacted or affected. Early marriages is one of the problems. The Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs of Yemen found that 1/4 of Yemeni girls married in the age before they reached 15 years old. So if we talk about 1/4 of the girls, we're talking about 2.5 million. Another study that was conducted by Oxfam that covered more than 1,000 partners, that 90% of women were married early. Violations against women. This is a very is a Yemeni phenomenon par excellence. In Yemen, we are a tribal community, and the habits and the traditions of the tribe marginalized the woman and didn't allow her to participate, and women described in several places as a burden, and this is an insulting word that shows that the woman is a burden and it just costs money. Women don't have any value with the family unless and when she's abandoned by the family, she will be subject to a lot of violations. In 2005, Amnesty International reported the story of Amina Abdel Latif, who was indicted of killing her husband. She was 16 years old. Although the Yemeni penal code prevents the execution for those who are below 18 years old, but she was indicted, and Ali Abdullah Saleh ratified the decision. And when she was in front of the shooting squad, the squad realized that she was pregnant. And the report says that she was raped by one of the prison guards, and she became pregnant because of that rape. So violence against women. Violence against women increased by 60% according to the Population United Nations funds, and the rates of forced labor increased, as well as the child labor, especially that with the lack of the protection of law makes women under the threat of domestic violence all the time. The new violations of war. I will speak first about violating the right to live, killing people. And here, of course, killing is on the top of the violations of war in Yemen because of the gravity of this violation and the increased number of victims. In another report of the National Commission for Investigation for the allegations in Yemen, they reported the fall of dozens of children and women, and in a report of SAM organization, we reported more than 2,000 children and women who were killed. The indiscriminate killing started to achieve since the beginning of the conflict in Yemen, and the Houthis start to bombard indiscriminately several areas in Yemen, including Shabu al-Bayda, Taz, and Lahaj. And according to the Human Rights Council, militia Houthi and Saleh killed more than 78 civilians and injured 24 at least since July 2016 until September 2017. In 18 January, al-Houthi militia and Saleh launched two bombs that believed to be mortars on a house in one of the neighborhoods in Taz. In 29 January 2017, al-Houthi militia bombarded Ma'rib east to Sana'a, the neighborhood of Balqis hotel, killing children. Airstrikes. Since March 2015, the Arab coalition led by the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia made several airstrikes in Yemen, killing dozens of civilians. According to Human Rights Watch, internationally banned weapons were used, including cluster bombs, and strikes of the coalition killed 1,000 civilians and targeted hospitals, schools, and some of these crimes are paramount to war crimes. In 30th of October 2017, the coalition air force striked a restaurant for in Sada, killing 24 civilians, and 4 people survived, but they were injured by deformations. The U.S. drones. After Donald Trump took office, the strikes by drones increased significantly, according to the Office of Investigative Journalism. The United Nations conducted 26 in the year 2016, 36 drone attacks, which was the last year of Obama. In 2017, 105 strikes were conducted by drones that the United States said they targeted Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. Assassinations, I'm not going to mention them because we have a long list of them. I'll talk about landmines. Landmines killed and deformed hundreds of civilians and disrupted civilian life in afflicted areas. Al-Houthi and Saleh militia used landmines in 6 governorates at least. So Human Rights Watch investigated in 10 incidents where landmines that were implanted by Houthi and Saleh militias in Sana'a, Ma'rib, Ta'az killed 2 people and injured 8 others. SAM reported 614 victims, including 129 who were killed and 29 children and 10 women, and 180 injuries, including women and children. Death under torture in detention places. A lot of organizations reported on torture, and the torture increased in these prisons of parties to the conflict, and they are increasing systematically. And the parties to the conflict are using that as a way of extracting confessions. Arbitrary detention and forced disappearance. We know that the Houthis are using that very much. And there are arbitrary detention and hidden prisons in the south of Yemen that are supervised by United Arab Emirates. I think that I exceeded my allocated time. Thank you for listening.
I suggest that the audience ask you questions and precisions after the second speaker. So if I may summarize your intervention, Mr. Aldani, you helped us understanding how the social structure pre-existing to the war allow some violations that are internal to the Yemeni society, and then you concluded by the indiscriminate bombings and also the use of torture and forced disappearances by all parties involved in this conflict. But as you know, even today, even this morning, we could hear from the international news that the NGO like Doctors Without Borders are very worried about what's happening in Hodeidah. And now I think this is a good point, a good transition to introduce Mrs. Lidell's speech, because now we are going to talk about the international responsibilities in the violation of human rights in Yemen. So please welcome her.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, honored guests. First of all, I would like to thank the Tawakkol Karman Foundation for inviting me to this very important meeting. You'll have to excuse me because I am writing from a prepared speech. I was very busy up until the time that I arrived. But please bear with me, and I'll take any questions afterwards. So just over 15 years ago, when the world was a very different place, all member states of the United Nations came together to endorse a new doctrine known as the Responsibility to Protect, or RTPP. And I'm not sure whether any of you remember this. The aim was to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. The responsibility to protect was based on the underlying premise that sovereignty entails a responsibility to protect all populations from mass atrocity, crimes, and human rights violations. But that was then. If ever there was a responsibility to protect, Yemen would certainly qualify. So where is the moral and political leadership necessary to do so? As all of us are well aware, the geopolitical landscape has changed greatly since 2005. I first met Hannah in 2012 outside of a coffee shop, just as the sun was setting behind the splendor of Sana's old city. She didn't know how old she was, but looked around 8 years of age. Hannah was the second youngest of 9 siblings and had been sent out into the streets to beg from the few foreigners who were still working in Yemen. The Arab Spring, which had begun with so much promise, had already shifted to something far darker. In Yemen, where the protests were initially far more peaceful and inclusive than elsewhere in the Arab world, foreign counter-revolutionaries began funding armed factions as Abdullah Saleh sought every means possible to hang on to power. As with almost all revolutions, the Arab Spring was to hearken in a winter of unrest, oppression, and armed conflict, which was to prove even worse than the dictatorship that preceded it. Now, from my perch in the all but empty Movenpick Hotel, I would fall asleep, lulled by the sound of gunfire, shelling, and wedding fireworks. It was a strange juxtaposition. After work, I would swim in the hotel's empty infinity pool and gaze down at the city as it was quite literally being torn apart. It was a peculiar time and one that I will never forget. It was little Hannah, however, who brought home to me the dire situation of most Yemenis: the hunger, the want, the lack of basic services and of simple reproductive health care, the fertility rates that guaranteed an exploding population, even as the country slipped further into famine. Hannah's father had been killed during the demonstrations. He wasn't a protester, but had been caught in the crossfire. My friend Thea, who spoke fluent Arabic, explained that Hannah's mother had begun beating her since her father had died, that the stresses of revolution, her husband's death, and ensuing deep poverty had left Hannah's mother unhinged and unable to cope. When I gave Hannah whatever money I had, she folded her tiny body into mine, and she wept. I left Yemen a few weeks later. Many years have gone by, but I'm still unable to erase the memory of her bony shoulders. I wonder if she is still alive. Her family was already barely hanging on, even back then, but the intervening years has brought nothing but catastrophe for the people of Yemen. For me, Hannah is the embodiment of that other Yemen that never makes it into the headlines, the one that is made up of real people, of the real suffering of real individuals to whom we owe the responsibility to protect. Needless to say, we are failing miserably. Forced to live under despots, religious fanatics, and constant war waged by foreign powers, they are the forgotten ones. They don't care about ideology. They care about survival. More than anything, the war in Yemen is a war on the poor. According to the UN, and forgive me, I'm repeating statistics that you've already heard today, but I'll repeat them again. According to the United Nations, 8 million Yemenis already depend on emergency food aid. The organization says that soon could rise to 14 million, which is exactly 1/2 of Yemen's population. The United Nations has declared only 2 famines during the last 30 years, one in Sudan and the other in Somalia. According to officials, Yemen is set to become the 3rd. And as with all proxy wars, the conflict in Yemen is incredibly complex and is characterized by multiple actors, all intent on pursuing their own agendas. Generally speaking, the more complex a conflict, the less likely a resolution, and the more likely that all of those involved will perpetrate gross human rights abuses that will only worsen over the years. In this, Yemen is no different from the conflicts in Darfur, the DR Congo, Afghanistan, and other wars that have grinded on for many, many years. To quote an old Afghan proverb, there is no good men among the living. All are guilty. According to the New York Times, aid workers say that in Houthi-held areas, commanders level illegal taxes at checkpoints and frequently try to divert international relief aid to the families of soldiers or to line their own pockets. The United Nations maintains that delayed visas, retracted work permits, and interference in their work stymie aid workers in the Houthi-held areas. Nevertheless, it is a Saudi-led coalition that has imposed a raft of punitive economic measures aimed at undercutting the Houthi rebels who control northern Yemen. But these actions, including blockades, import restrictions, and the withholding of the salaries of more than 1 million civil servants, have laid waste to an already tottering economy. They are driving millions into outright starvation. Reporters tell of supermarkets stuffed with goods. Nevertheless, a huge proportion of Yemenis can't afford to purchase anything. The end result? Famine and cholera. Both are entirely preventable, but no one will claim the responsibility to protect. And why should they? We now live in an era where the strongman, the autocrat, and the despot is once more on the ascendant. All over the world, in the United States, Brazil, the Balkans, the Philippines, India, and Africa, nations are jettisoning the dream of a pluralistic democracy in favor of a hyper-masculine populism, nationalism, and hate. The world's only superpower is on the wane and now favors the very types of government it used to condemn, at least publicly. In many respects, the America that we are now seeing is in fact the real deal. The foreign policy that propped up dictators from Duarte to Pinochet and that resulted in the illegal invasion of Iraq is now exposed for what it really is. What once festered in the shadows is now out in the open. When Donald Trump cited the $110 billion Saudi arms deal as the reason his government would not take action following the sadistic murder of Jamal Khashoggi, he was essentially admitting that the corruption of Americans' foreign policy by the arms trade with the Saudis was not only okay, but completely acceptable. The US has always ignored Saudi Arabia as the epicenter and source of Islamic extremism worldwide, even when it discovered that 15 of the 19 hijackers that slammed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were Saudis. Nevertheless, the Bush family's cozy relationship with the royal family is exceeded only by that of the Trumps and the Kushners. Both families enjoy considerable Saudi patronage, which all but guarantee that the kingdom and its proxy wars will only be met with silence. The scrapping of the Iran agreement flies in the face of what an engaged superpower should be doing, which is bringing belligerents together to work out their issues instead of allowing them to destroy defenseless and impoverished third countries. In fact, the very security of our planet depends on it. Elsewhere, middle powers such as France and the UK have also opted for mildly embarrassed protests in the face of Saudi power and influence. They too are held hostage by an arms trade worth billions, the very same arms and munitions that are now wreaking havoc on a defenseless Yemeni population. In the UK, military sales to Saudi Arabia leapt by 2/3 from 2016 to 2017, an increase of more than 450 million pounds. The real figure, however, could be much higher. According to the Department of International Trade, the number of so-called secret open licenses doubled during the same 12 months, from 21 to 44. In 2017, the UK issued 126 licenses relating to military goods, from £679 million in 2016 to $1.129 billion in 2017. So far as my own country is concerned, and despite an otherwise enlightened foreign policy, Canada's $15 billion deal to sell light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia is likely to go ahead, even though Canada's feminist foreign policy should preclude trade with what some have described as the world's largest prison for women. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, cited the $1 billion price tag to rescind the deal as the reason why we will go ahead. A recent survey showed that most Canadians agree, I don't, by the way, but overwhelmingly want to end such deals in the future. They recognize that the very integrity of our democracy lies at stake, if not the very stability of the entire world. Bottom line, the corrupting influence of Saudi Arabia is to be felt in all countries. This all but sequesters it from global condemnation for everything from the disappearances, incarceration, and murders of dissidents to the man-made famine that is now starving 1/2 of Yemen's population. The kingdom's investments in Silicon Valley and high-tech should likewise elicit real concern. Information is the new oil, and its influence is even more insidious. Is there hope for Yemen? Based on what we've seen so far and the cruelty, greed, and fanaticism of the main players, it is not looking good. My prediction is that despite tentative talk of sanctions, this war will rumble on, that waves of famine will continue to engulf the population, even as atrocities will become more common as the Saudis, Iran, the UAE, and other players continue to recruit mercenaries to do their dirty work. We need to impose economic sanctions on all belligerents to force them to the table. We need to ensure that any peace talks include a substantial proportion of women. We need to freeze all arms sales to all aggressors, and we need to suspend all Saudi royal family travel visas. And we need to pressure the US to jettison its warmly congenial relationship to the Crown Prince, who is revealing himself to be little more than a straw man reformer in the mold of former Libya dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Clearly, peace talks must be convened along with a ceasefire, which needs to be implemented to permit the delivery of humanitarian supplies. Should the Saudi blockade prevent aid to be delivered via the port city of Hodeidah, then we will need to consider a UN-sponsored international airlift. All wishful thinking, I know. This is because the West is paralyzed by its own corruption, while the responsibility to protect, hearkened in with so much hope in 2005, is all but dead. It is a revenant of another time when member states seemed to believe that civilian lives actually meant something. I believe that the war in Yemen is a significator of more to come, that while Yemenis suffer, the world will continue to stand by and fiddle. And what of Hannah? I can't even imagine. One starving child bereft of love and hope. Her story is simply one of among millions. We need to do more than care. We need to act. But what is the likelihood? Who among this corrupted and complicit gaggle of special interests, once known as nation states, is brave enough and capable of leading? The international community is no longer international, and it is certainly no longer a community. We drift rudderless upon uncertain seas with only hope as our lodestar. No war lasts forever. Let us just hope that the next spring will be a lasting one.
Thank you, Ms. Lytle. So if I may summarize your speech,